I light this chalice with these words. Open our eyes to see what is beautiful. Open our minds to learn what is true. Open our hearts to love one another. Please join me in the affirmation of covenant, which you will find printed in your order of service, saying, love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with each other. Covenant with each other.
Our guest speaker today is Reverend Mark P. Clark. Reverend Clark is both a retired lawyer and a minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. He practiced law in both Arkansas and Texas and was the pastor of churches in North and South Carolina. He is currently on the adjunct faculty of UALR Bowen School of Law and teaches a section of a trial skills course and a seminar on law and religion. He is married to Reverend Carol Clark, who is on the staff of the Presbytery of Arkansas. Welcome, Reverend Clark. We're delighted you're here.
Well, I do. I appreciate very much being invited here to speak this morning, and I've been asked to talk today about separation of church and state. And while I teach law and religion at the law school, I've actually never really given a talk before specifically on the separation of church and state. So I wrote it all out in advance, and I read it to my wife, and I asked her what she thought. She read it, and she said, well, she thought it was fairly interesting, but it was a little bit dry. She suggested I throw a joke in at the beginning to lighten the mood, so. All right, I'm doing what you say, Carol. This guy walks into a bar, he sits down, he orders a drink, he starts eating the beer nuts there on the bar counter when he hears a voice say, wow, say, you look great tonight. Well, the man looks over at the bartenders at the end of the counter who didn't say anything, and so he just keeps drinking and eating the beer nuts when he hears something again. That is an awesome shirt. You are amazing. Well, the guy looks around, and he's the only one in the bar, so he asks the bartender if he heard anything, and the bartender says, well, was the voice saying bad things or good things? Well, the man replies, good things. Why? And the bartender says, I'll pay that no mind, that's just the complimentary nuts. And speaking of nuts, I'll be talking about some Supreme Court decisions a little bit later, but for now, as a Presbyterian minister, it is our custom when we speak in worship to use a text as a basis for what's said. So I'd like to read a biblical passage, I believe is pertinent to today's topic, taken from the New Testament of the Bible. Now, I selected this text because it is a fairly straightforward rendition of Jesus' view, I believe, of the separation of church and state. Well, it may be a bit unfair to equate the circumstance that Jesus faced with a modern view of church and state. Jesus, after all, he wasn't a Roman citizen, but he was really a captive Hebrew, subject to the military dominance of the Roman Empire. But regardless, I think that Jesus' answer to the question provides at least a window for how we might think about the proper relationship between church, religious institutions, and government and state. So listen as I read from Mark chapter 12, verses 13 through 17. Then they sent to Jesus some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in what he said. And they came and they said to him, Teacher, we know that you are sincere and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. Is it lawful? We're going to have to do something, man. Can you turn the volume down at all? Well, I'd rather they not hear me than they hear feedback, to be honest. There we go. Okay, good. Thank you. Well, see, how is it without it? Can you hear me?
Yeah, put it down there. That'll help.
Okay. Well, I have a weak voice, so if you can't hear me, then raise your hand. I'll start the passage again. Then they sent to Jesus some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in what he said. And they came and they said to him, "Teacher, we know that you're sincere and you show deference to no one. You don't regard people with partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not?" But knowing their hypocrisy, Jesus said to them, "Why are you putting me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me see it." And they brought one. Then Jesus said to them, "Whose head is this and whose title?" They answered, "Caesar's." Jesus said to them, "Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were utterly amazed. Jesus' answer was simple. Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and give to God the things that are God's. These are obligations to the one and obligations to the other, and never the twain shall meet. You see, that was the ideal of James Madison, who, when pondering the task of writing an amendment to the Constitution protecting religious freedom in 1790, said government should be so free of influence from religious organizations as to, quote, take no cognizance of theological thought or religious authority. In Madison's view, the government shouldn't even be aware of religion, no cognizance. He thought that if government was prevented from interfering with religious organizations and vice versa, including supporting them with tax dollars, that the churches would proliferate, they would grow, and the competition among the various denominations and theological viewpoints would lead to dramatic growth in faith and church membership. In other words, don't tend the field or manipulate it, let the field grow, and grow it did. But, politics being politics, Madison's preferred language for religious protection never made it, didn't win the day. Rather, at the end of weeks of political wrangling and compromise, the nation's religious protections ended up being only these 16 words that we're all well familiar with. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Notice there are no words that guarantee or even support the concept of separation of church and state. Notice also that the amendment only applies to Congress, not the states. Madison fought to have the amendment apply to the states as well as the federal government, but he lost. Political wrangling. And so several states, even after ratification of the First Amendment, and for many, many years afterwards, continued to support various Christian denominations with tax dollars. In fact, several states prohibited Catholics, some other states prohibited Jews from ever even being eligible to hold elected office. In some, the First Amendment religious protection clauses, they're simply two broad phrases capable of multiple and even conflicting interpretations. For instance, when it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, that could be interpreted to mean merely that Congress is forbidding setting up a particular religious denomination as the official religion of the United States. Anything else Congress wants to do is okay. Just don't pass a law saying that Catholics, or Jews, or the Congregational Church, the UCC Church, or the Presbyterian Church is the state religion. It's really all that phrase could mean, prohibiting the establishment of religion. Likewise, when it says Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise, it could be interpreted to mean only that Congress is not to pass a law that directly prohibits your holding a particular religious view. Be Christian or Hindu or Santeria. And so, under this view, while you can think or say anything you want about religion, you still have to obey the law, even if the law interferes with your religious practice. And basically, these were the interpretations given to the religious protection clauses of the First Amendment for the next 150 years after ratification of the First Amendment. So long as Congress didn't set up a national religion, and so long as it didn't overtly ban a religious practice, the First Amendment was said to be honored. And while the religious protections of the First Amendment lay languishing in disuse, the erosion of the separation, the idea of separating government from church and vice versa, what is owed Caesar and what is owed God, that erosion that continued unabated for a long time. And there are many examples, but the best one that I can think of the lack of separation of the church and state in our country is seen in the history of our public school system. So you recall the English settlements in Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, and other early colonies. They had no concept of separation of church and state. These were theocracies where pastors were the governors, and the priests were the mayors, and it was all one and the same. And these colonies early on set up taxpayer-supported public schools. And you may have heard of some of them. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, William and Mary, all of these were state-supported public institutions. And they were primarily set up initially solely to train ministers in whatever the particular denomination was. James Madison attended Princeton, which is now a Presbyterian seminary, but at the time was an evangelical seminary, exclusively to train ministers, and only later did they add the courses that were now more identify these colleges with. So, as one might expect, religion was at the core of all public school education in the 17th and the 18th century. Colonists actually literally imported by ship school books from England, most notably the English Tudor, Protestant Tudor, which taught all subjects within the framework of a Calvinist theology. Remember, the colonists were Calvinists, the Pilgrims and the Puritans, who had divided themselves off from the Church of England. And the growth of the taxpayer-supported public education continued unabated through the 18th and 19th century, from elementary school all the way through college. The mid-19th century and early 20th century public school textbooks were typically, and you may be familiar with these titles, were called McGuffey readers, which initially taught lessons from a strict Calvinist viewpoint. Later, they kind of lightened it up a little bit into sort of a civic Protestant theology. And this continued all the way through, I am guessing, about 100% chance that many of you in your public schools were exposed to this kind of a hybridized, modernized Protestant ethic. I went to Hall High School, and we still had the Bible read to us every morning in homeroom. In the mid-19th century, it was common for public schools everywhere to use the Bible to teach morality to students. Prayers and religious lessons were openly led by teachers and school officials. Public schools were openly Protestant and proud of it. But here's the problem. As long as everybody goes along with it, what's the problem? But by this time, not every school child was a Protestant. Far from it. By the 1850s, Roman Catholics, first largely from Ireland and then later from German and Italy and a Polish immigration, the Roman Catholics were burgeoning. And they weren't exactly excited about their children being instructed about how to be a good Protestant in public schools their tax dollars were paying for. The Catholics objected to being taught only from the King James Bible. They had their own Bible, the Douay Rheims version, which was heavily annotated with interpretations of passages approved by the Pope, by the Catholic Church. The Pope, that's right. They also had 8 additional books that in our Bibles today is called the Apocrypha. They also had a different version of the Ten Commandments. And the thing of these Roman Catholics, they didn't object to the use of the King James Version being taught, but they wanted their Bible to be taught alongside it. And how did the Protestants respond? Absolutely not. No way. The Catholics are heathens. You do not teach a heathen religion in our public schools. And This led to riots in the 1840s and the 1850s. Believe it or not, actual riots broke out. Catholic homes and churches were burned. People were killed. These conflicts helped spur the creation of the Catholic parochial schools. Some of you may have attended Catholic High. And the conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants in public schools continued to grow. Protestants were adamant that Protestantism only be taught in the public schools. Catholics responded that if that's the case, okay, tax money should be used to help support the Catholic schools, since Catholic taxpayers were footing the bill for the Protestant public schools. Again, the answer overwhelmingly was no way. We will continue to teach Protestantism in public schools, and Catholics get no money for their private schools. And remember again, the First Amendment. Where's the First Amendment? When's this going to start kicking in? Remember, the First Amendment only applied to federal government. It was not applied to the states during all of this time. And this was not an oversight. The framers of the Bill of Rights absolutely knew this. This was political sausage making. They couldn't get it, the advocates couldn't get this passed so that it applied to the states. And so the public schools, they just rolled on as openly Protestant oriented education, and until, and not sure why, but at some point in the mid-20th century, the Supreme Court began to take an interest in the schools and the Establishment Clause, which is to say within the lifetimes of many of us that are gathering here. Essentially, until the lifetimes of many of us gathered here, the First Amendment basically lay dormant. It was little used and little referred to. But in 1948, in McCullum versus Board of Education, the court held that the practice of having religious instructors from different churches come into the public school classes and give religious instruction during the school day violated the Establishment Clause. A big deal, which only 1 year prior had the Establishment Clause been held to apply to the states. And then in 1962, in Engel versus Vitale, the court held that a required resuscitation of a non-sectarian prayer by the children in the public school was an unconstitutional sponsorship by a government institution of a religious activity. And then the following year, in 1963, the court ruled that the routine reading of the Bible in class also constituted state sponsorship of a religious activity in violation of the Establishment Clause. I'm guessing the Little Rock Public Schools were a few years behind in that, because that happened in 63, and I was in high school in 67 through 69 and still heard the Bible every day in homeroom. Since then, multiple attempts to put religious practices or iconography, icons, into public schools has been rejected. In 1980, the court rejected attempts to post the Ten Commandments in classrooms. In 1985, the requirement of a minute of silent meditation was rejected. In 1992, a school-sponsored prayer at a commencement by an invited clergy was invalidated. And various attempts to interject creationism or intelligent design into biology curriculum at the public schools have been rebuffed by the Supreme Court as unpermitted religious instruction. And so, overly brief, but this is a summary of how the Supreme Court over the past 70 years held at bay those that would thrust their religious views on public school children. But now all of that's in jeopardy. All of that's in play again. All the cases those past 70 years. Just this summer, can you believe it? Just 8 weeks ago. And not only in this case of Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, but in others as well. But specifically in the Kennedy versus Bremerton School District case, the Establishment Clause and its protections of the public school children has been put into issue. Joe Kennedy was an assistant football coach in the suburban Seattle school district. He insisted on praying on the 50-yard line immediately after home games, with his players joining him. Even players and coaches from the other team would join him on the 50-yard line after each home game. The school district, fearing it would be liable to sue for violating the Establishment Clause by appearing to a neutral bystander to endorse this sort of Christian prayer, told him he can pray, Joe, anywhere you want, really. You can pray in the press box, you can pray in the locker room, you can even, if you'll wait for the crowd to disperse and the lights to come off the stadium, you can go out to the 50-yard line and pray. Just don't pray at the 50-yard line with the players immediately after the game. Well, the coach didn't like that. Litigation ensued, and Coach Kennedy lost at every level. He lost over and over and over and over. He lost twice at the district court level. They said, no, that behavior violates the Establishment Clause, puts the school district in jeopardy of violating the Constitution. He also lost twice on his appeals to the Court of Appeals level. He was even denied review by the Supreme Court. But then something happened. What happened?
Court changed.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and Senator McConnell got Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court. That made all the difference. Now, armed with a decisive conservative supermajority, the court dusted off its denied writ for certiorari and reversed themselves and granted review. Well, you know, when they turn it down first and the court changes and now they grant review, what do you think is going to happen? We all knew the coach was teaching at the Park Hill Presbyterian Church before this case came down. And we already knew Coach Kennedy was going to win. We just didn't know whether it was going to be 5-4 or 6-3. Well, it was 6-3. Found that the coach was actually, believe it or not, engaging in private prayer. Reporters, cameras, dozens of players on one knee all around it notwithstanding. And so now the Establishment Clause lays idle once again, as it did for the first 150 years of this nation's history. And of course, the recent blurring of church and state isn't only evidence in the Kennedy case. It had its beginnings, really, in the 2015 case of Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, where the Supreme Court held that a corporation that employs more than 43,000 people can hold a religious view. Shareholders can hold a religious view. Imagine if Microsoft had a religious view, or IBM or whatnot. And that religious view was that several of the contraceptives mandated to be offered without charge to women employees under the Affordable Care Act caused abortions. And the court agreed with Hobby Lobby. And so a number of contraceptives mandated by Obamacare were taken off of the list of health care available for Hobby Lobby employees and any others similarly situated, not just them. Now, this view was expanded in a 2018 case of Little Sisters of the Poor, which the court upheld a Trump-initiated regulation that permitted businesses, any business with a religious objection, to cut out providing any contraceptives from their mandated Obama health care plans. As a result, several 100,000 women were denied the no-cost contraceptive coverage that was mandated by the federal government under the Affordable Care Act. And then there's this is a famous case. It really didn't amount to anything. But it was a Masterpiece Bake Shop versus Colorado, 2018, where the Supreme Court held that because of several negative comments made by members of a state administrative commission that a baker didn't have to sell a wedding cake to a same-sex couple for their wedding ceremony, even though Colorado specifically had anti-discrimination laws that expressly forbid the refusal to sell products in the marketplace based on sexual orientation. Then there was the 2020 case of Our Lady of Guadalupe, where the court held that religious schools are exempt from federal employment and disability protection laws. Now, this is a case, it's interesting because the separation of church and state was used by the court to help religious organizations. The court said that there is a ministerial exception through the laws of the land that protect employees from sexual discrimination, racial discrimination, disabilities, and so the religious organizations can be free to hire and fire what the court said were their ministers. However, in this case, the ministers were elementary school teachers. They weren't pastors. They didn't preside over church ceremonies or rituals. They didn't deliver sermons. They were elementary school teachers who taught regular elementary school subjects. They did have some minimal responsibilities for taking the children to Mass and answering any questions they might have about that, and some other minimal things. But the Supreme Court carved out this big area for the churches to, if they want, it's a law-free area. You can discriminate all you want if you are a religious institution, and you can somehow call the employee you want to get rid of a minister. In this case, elementary teachers. One of them was fired because the school thought she was too old. She taught there 20 years. I thought that was long enough. The other one, because she needed time off for cancer treatments. Our Lady of Guadalupe, read the case. Read a summary of it. It's interesting in a chilling way. And with the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the installation of Amy Coney Barrett in 2020, the number of cases like these in which conservative Roman Catholic and evangelical Christian views overran areas previously protected by anti-discrimination laws, accelerated exponentially. In 2021, in the case of Fulton versus City of Philadelphia, the court held that a Catholic foster child placement agency in Philadelphia did not have to honor the anti-discrimination laws of that city, and was actually in the contract that Catholic Social Services signed. And the court allowed the Catholic agency to refuse to place foster children in the homes of same-sex couples. 8 weeks ago. The same week as Kennedy versus Bremerton. This is just in June. In the case of Carson versus Macon, the court held that the state of Maine, if it was going to make any funds available to any public school, had to equally make funds available, tax dollars, to religious schools, no matter the religious views being taught and whether or not the religious school mixed its biology or history lessons with its own theological views. This also meant that tax dollars would be spent on schools that could refuse to hire teachers or other staff on account of their own religious views or racial preference or sexual orientation. Again, they carved out another discrimination-free zone. This fall, the court's going to hear the case of 303 Creative versus Alinas. It's on their docket for October, involving a woman who does web designs and graphic art for wedding couples, and she doesn't want to have to do them for same-sex couples, even though the law says that she should, that she must. And of course, she has about as much chance, as the court granted review, of losing as the Harlem Globetrotters have in losing to the team they pay to travel with them. The only mystery ever left is which way Justice Roberts is going to go. Is it going to be 5-4 or 6-3? But we are going to have a law, I predict, by winter that permits people engaging in the marketplace to choose whether or not to sell their product based upon their preference for somebody's sexual orientation. In all of these cases, we're seeing bias by the court in allowing Roman Catholic and evangelical religious views to overrun hard-won protections against religious instructions in our public schools, and use of tax dollars to support religious instruction, and protections against discrimination in schools or businesses and in the marketplace. But I've saved the biggest incursion of religious views in the government policies for the last, the case of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, also decided 8 weeks ago. Can you believe that? Just 8 weeks. This, as you know, was a case where the court ruled there was no longer a constitutional right to privacy. And they didn't have to rule that way in order to uphold the Mississippi ban of abortion after 15 weeks, but they had the votes to do so, and so they did. So now, in our nation, there is no right to privacy, because in the opinion of the court, there was no historical tradition of protecting the right of abortion, and therefore there is now no right to abortion, and the states are free to regulate it however they please, even ban it if they choose, and we live in a state that chose to ban it. I put this case in the category of a religious case, even though religion's nowhere mentioned in the decision, because Roman Catholics have long led a charge to make abortion illegal, and 7 out of the 9 members of the Supreme Court presently sitting are Roman Catholic. And all of the justices voting in favor of overturning Roe versus Wade are Catholic. Justice Gorsuch is now a member of Episcopal Church, but he grew up Catholic. In fact, he and Justice Kavanaugh went to the same Catholic prep school. But further, the impetus and energy for the anti-abortion movement can be traced back to key people in the evangelical Christian moral majority movement. You remember the moral majority in Jerry Falwell in the 70s. And you can see evidence of the religious basis for abortion bans in the statutory language that's used in these abortion ban statutes. And you have no reason to know this unless you're a lawyer, unless you like to mess around and read statutes in your spare time. But the Arkansas statute that bans abortion, this is the law today, right now, as we said, uses the term, quote, unborn child, end quote, to refer to a single cell of a fertilized egg, whether or not it ever attaches to the uterus or not. So a single cell zygote is now an unborn child. Well, that has no medical meaning. It only makes sense if one's view is that a single cell zygote is a child. That's a religious view. That's not a medical view. And so religious language is steeped in not only abortion bans, but other statutes that I don't have time to go into today. The removal of the constitutional right to privacy is probably the largest religious incursion in the governmental policy in our lifetimes. The Dobbs case will call into question not just abortion, but other privacy rights that are hard won in the areas of contraception, same-sex intimacy, and marriage and interracial marriage. They're all under attack now by persons holding particular religious viewpoints. Now, the problem with overrunning our laws of equality with religious views, of narrowing the gap between church and state, is that the religious views that dominate now aren't everybody's religious views, or their moral or ethical views, regardless of religion. The religious views being imposed on society now, well, they're not what I was taught as a Christian at the Pulaski Heights Presbyterian Church over on Woodlawn. I was taught that God loves everybody equally and that all are entitled to enjoy life's bounty, regardless of their race, regardless of where they were born, regardless of their circumstance, regardless of their sexual orientation. I was taught that all life is sacred, a woman's as well as the life she carries inside her. I was taught not to call attention to myself when praying, but rather to go into my closet and pray in private to my Lord. I don't say my religious views are right and that they ought to be imposed on others, but I do say that neither should somebody else's religious views be imposed on me through the power of the state. There is great wisdom in Jesus' words that we are to give to Caesar that which is his and give to God that which is God's. And never the twain shall meet. May God's blessings be on all who are gathered here. Amen.
Go out into the world in peace Have courage. Hold on to what is good. Return to no person evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the suffering. Honor all beings. Valerie, I invite you back up to extinguish our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Amen. Bless you. Namaste. Go in peace. Enjoy the music.